Hello friends, I am Professor Rabia and I'm happy to be with you to talk about the most serious challenge facing us today, facing us as Americans, as Europeans, and as citizens of the global village in which we all live today. And the challenge that I have in mind is the global debt crisis. As all of you know, so many countries have borrowed and spent too much money over the last 2 to 3 decades, and today they reach a point where they are unable to borrow too much money and they cannot function normally without borrowing much more money. At the same time, most of the economies of the countries that have borrowed so much money are either stagnating, some of them are contracting. So we have an economic crisis and a debt crisis, which means that we are facing a challenge unforeseen before. And if we try to examine the impact of the tools that have been applied in Europe and have been applied in the United States, which over there they emphasized austerity programs, and here we emphasized more spending to revive and invigorate the economy, we'll find out that on both sides, the measures that have been used, like the interest rate and spending more money and so on, have not worked. So the question is that, do we have a solution for this problem? And I believe we do. And this is why I'm here today. I'm here to tell you that I have developed a plan to enable all countries, rich and poor, to repay their debt now, to restructure the international monetary system and put it on solid basis, and to create what I call it the necessary conditions for global economic growth and development for decades to come. But before I outline my plan to you, let us take 2 to 3 more minutes and talk about the debt and why the measures that are being applied in Europe and here and talked about are not working and they are not going to work. The debt today is estimated at $53 trillion. And if we add interest on this debt, it will become to $73 trillion. Most of the debt actually today is owed by the rich countries, the European industrial countries, and Japan and America. They owe today about $44 trillion, or about 85% of the global debt. I'm sure that many of you are old enough, like me, to remember the 1980s. We had a similar debt crisis, but the actors at that time were poorer countries, mainly Latin American countries. The total debt at that time was about $1.2 trillion. So our debt today is about 50 times the debt of the 1980s. In the 1980s, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the United States government, they all intervened and forced those countries to adopt austerity programs just like the ones that are being recommended everywhere today and applied. And the result was devastating for Latin America and other third world countries. The 1980s is being called now in our textbooks as the lost decade for Latin America. They lost per capita income over a full decade. The 1990s was Japan's lost decade, and Japan lost it because also of budget deficit and debt and other things related to a mortgage or housing problem. And the first decade of this century has been Italy's lost decade. So it seems that every country or a group of countries are having their own lost decades. And also the record shows that none of the countries that lost a decade was able to come back fully and try to resume economic growth. And I believe that the decade that started with the Great Recession could be catastrophic for the Western countries and the world at large. Because if Western economies collapse, then the rest of the world economy will collapse. Poverty and homelessness and crime and violence will be uncontrollable. No one can really imagine the size of the chaos that will be created as a result of this. Now, why are these measures not working today? The reason is not really hard to understand. Any theory is like a house. It has to have its own basis. So when you build the basis, you can build the house. So if termites come after 50, 60, 100 years and they just eat the foundation, then the house is no longer good. You cannot live in it. You have to leave it and run away out of it. And this is exactly what happened to our theory. The assumptions on which the theory that we are using today was built are no longer valid. And because they are not valid, then the theory is not valid, and the tools that are being used cannot deliver the goods, cannot do the job that we're supposed to do and were able to do in the past. Why things are changing this way? Because globalization, free trade, the internet, and the free market have created a one global economy where we no longer have national economies. In fact, 51 of the largest 100 economies in the world today are corporations, not national economies. And they are the major players who make the decisions. And this undermines the ability of every single state to manage its economy and to be able to deal with whatever problems, financial and economic, is facing. The second major point that comes into this is that when Asian countries were industrialized and became producers, our capacity, the global capacity to produce, exceeds our global capacity to consume. So we have a glut of supplies of many goods. The exception is food and oil. Other than that, we have a glut. And all recessions usually are caused by gluts, when you have the supply exceeds demand. And we cannot tell China or India or Korea, please stop producing for a few years so we can absorb this glut and the European and American economy start growing. So the only markets that we have today, potential markets, exist in the third world. So we have to expand the markets in order to absorb what we have, the surplus, and enable other economies like our economy to start growing again and growing at a fast rate. Now let me try to outline my plan to you. The first point in the plan calls for the designation of the International Monetary Fund to be a global central bank. Since we have today a global economy, every economy has its own central bank. So the IMF will become the central bank for our global economy with authority to issue a new currency that I called it RAMO, R-A-M-O. So the moment the RAMO is created, it becomes the reference currency, the internationally recognized currency, and all other currencies like the euro and the yen and the dollar will be picked against this currency. This will stabilize currencies and stabilize exchange rates and make it less possible for politicians and traders to manipulate any currency against other currencies. The second point calls for all indebted nations, rich and poor, to pay in their own currencies whatever they owe plus the interest, which, as I mentioned earlier, comes to about $73 trillion. So the IMF will take this money, open a trust account, or what you might call it an escrow account, where all this money will be deposited there, not to be invested, will be used only to pay the financial obligations of other countries. So the minute those countries pay their debt to the IMF, they are free, totally free, and the IMF assumes the responsibility for all the debt obligations and has the money to pay it when they become due. The third point calls upon all those nations to pay an extra 10%, which comes to $7.3 trillion, and this money will be used mainly for setting up three funds, which I will talk about in 1 minute. The fourth point calls upon all nations to reduce their budget deficit by at least half a percentage point every year and to balance their budgets within 10 years. In fact, many of the highly indebted states, even like Greece and Ireland and Portugal, probably by the time they pay their debt, they might have even a surplus. Because most of the budget deficit they have today is due to paying interest on what they owe today. Now, what are we going to do with the $7.3 trillion? We will set up 3 funds. The first one, I call it educational. And this educational fund will have $1 trillion to establish 50 new universities, world-class universities, all over the world, to service as many people as possible, and to give education to the best students free for life. And those students will be trained to create solutions, to find solutions to local problems everywhere, to be trained, to be committed to peace, to equality, to justice, to freedom, and to making our global village a more livable place and more suitable place for us all to love and live in it. The second fund is to establish what I call Humanitarian Fund. $1 trillion will go to establish this fund to meet all emergencies like tsunamis, like earthquakes, like storms, like victims of war, diseases, because our community, the international community, is not well prepared to meet these emergencies comprehensively and completely and in time. So this fund will have the resources, financial and otherwise, to be able to meet all these emergencies. The third and last fund will have about $5 trillion to establish what I call it the Global Sustainable Development Fund. And this fund will spend the money over 20 to 25 years to help all underdeveloped countries develop and join the rest of the developed nations in this global village as partners, as equal partners, and also as good neighbors, where all of us enjoy our village and be able to share it and share whatever it has to offer. I believe, my friends, this is the only way to get out of the recession and the problems and the debt crisis that we are in today. And if we don't, I'm sorry to say that I expect things, catastrophes will happen in the United States as well as in Europe and the rest of the world, because the rest of the world will follow. And we might have violence and crime that is unbelievable to control or even to manage or even to foresee. So we need to do this. And I would like to add the last point, that politicians who are elected, they are not elected, they don't see themselves as problem solvers. They only know how to manage problems. Why? Because solving a problem takes time and effort, and they don't have it. And by the time any problem becomes a crisis, they are no longer there. They have already died, or they are no longer in office. And if somebody inherits a problem like President Obama, he can blame it on the other. So what we have today, that we as people all over the world, particularly students, because actually I was inspired by students demonstrating in England and in the United States against raising tuition fees. We have to take this in our own hands and tell the leaders that you have to do it. And all those people who got in the streets, like in Tunisia and in Egypt and in Syria and other places, and before that in Germany and in the Philippines, all of them, they got out because they stood against something. Now, my friends, we have something to stand for, not only just against. So we are against this paralysis, political and economic paralysis that is dominating our world, and now we have a solution to stand for, to demand that this has to be done today. Otherwise, we will face catastrophe. And I'll stop here, and thank you very much for watching and listening.